So picking up right where we left off in the last video, which was Condal's arc, we're jumping right into Tim's arc, which I really appreciated a lot for what it did with Zeke, as it made him much more appreciative of his comrades, even more so than before, as in prior arcs, Zeke never really dwelled on his feelings or his comrades really that much, and he really only used his head to think about what he should do to his enemies and how he could torture them the most. But after this arc with Tim's death, Zeke really started to care about his comrades more and really just open up more, especially to Lila, as he tells Lila about his true origins and that he's not aware of the future because of dreams that he has, much like Lila, but rather that Zeke actually regressed, which is a huge secret that Zeke reveals to Lila, because this is the kind of secret that you would probably want to take to your grave. And Zeke sharing this with Lila just really shows how much he is starting to trust them. On top of this, I really appreciated that the author didn't write Lila in a manner that is reminiscent of CW characters, because in CW shows, a character will literally do the most unnecessary things in reaction to a character revealing a secret that they kept for an arguably understandable reason, just because their feelings were hurt. But I appreciate that in this novel, the author wrote Lila in a way that she is very understandable, although she is understandably hurt by Zeke's betrayal, because in a world where all she has is memories of future events that will either happen or will cease to happen, the only person that she could really relate to and or trust was Zeke, and Zeke revealing to her that he really isn't like her would understandably hurt her. And I'm just happy that this didn't turn into a whole subplot, an annoying subplot where Zeke has to make up to her or whatever. After this arc is Finel's arc and the Tree of Water. And something that I found to be very emphasized in this arc, or something that I found to be very prevalent throughout this arc, was the group's trust for each other that was just put on full display throughout the arc. Because although the group's trust for each other is on display in other arcs, I feel that this arc especially put a heavy emphasis on it, especially in moments when Zeke was abducted underwater. And even though the group was facing hardships in their battle against Finel, the group had full trust in Zeke to not only overcome this challenge, but to also save their lives once he was done with this challenge. And just seeing how much faith that the group has in Zeke with their lives and everything on the line just brings a tear to my eye. In terms of the answers that this arc gave, in terms of Lila's past and Finel's past, I felt that at the time of reading, this arc really made me have more questions than answers, because I had no idea at the time how Finel was still alive and how Lila was also still alive, because they should be thousands, tens of thousands of years old, as even elves struggle to remember what Clowen is. And having these two literal relics still be alive, around, and breathing just made me wonder how this was even possible. And on the topic of Finel, I felt really bad for Finel, because all her life, all she's been experiencing is just suffering, pain, and agony. And when she is finally free of all this suffering, pain, and agony from the researchers, she runs into the Demon Lord and basically gets killed. And once she regresses for whatever reason, some twist of cruel fate, she once again gets killed by Lila and her group. And you just can't help but feel bad for Finel. Maybe it might just be me, but Finel is just feels like a horribly tragic character that, although she was trying to get at Zeke and kill Lila, you can't help but kind of understand where she's coming from. Before I conclude with this arc, some things that I should bring up that I thought were either funny or that should be of note is, firstly, Zeke using operant conditioning on a Kraken to literally use it as a taxi and get it to go where he wanted. I thought that was hilarious. I also found it interesting that Zeke was able to kill the Kraken. Well, not that part, but this part, that Zeke was able to fit a literal Kraken into his magic storage system, which is insane because these things are gigantic. Moving on to the next arc with Maralyn, I had my fingers crossed the whole entire time that Maralyn was being introduced that she would not be a villain, because I just really liked Maralyn's character, as she was just a ball of joy and she was just bubbly and she just made everyone in the team much more happy. Even me, the reader, she made me much more happy. Although she turned out to be a villain, I'm not mad though, because Maralyn did wonders for Zeke and Lila's relationship, because she just really pushed Lila to take the next step in their relationship, there as in Lila and Zeke's relationship, because without the intervention of someone like Maralyn, I don't think Lila would ever find out whatever the feelings that she was feeling towards Zeke were. And although Zeke was probably aware of the feelings that Lila had, I don't think Zeke is someone that would go out of his way to help someone with feelings such as love that he probably sees as something juvenile or childish. So for that reason, I'm really thankful towards Maralyn. On the topic of Lila and Zeke's relationship, I also really like that Zeke doesn't just fall in love true to his character. Zeke's standards are beyond just beauty, and you have to actually be worthy for Zeke to fall in love with you, not the other way around, because Zeke doesn't chase after beauties, he's only chasing after strength as he's on his eternal grind set. Moving on, we get the next arc with Tyll, and it remains true that I feel bad for Laura, because in the last video I said I felt bad for her. Well, in this video I feel bad for her also, because in this arc we really just get to see how much Laura is suffering within her group because of just how much of a dick and how much of a baby Glenn is, as he's just throwing temper tantrums, and on the receiving end is Laura, who's just surrounded by a group of phonies and fakes. Chelsea, Glenn, well, the magic girl isn't really that bad, and I forget if there's any other girls, but yeah, it just, the people that Laura is surrounded with, they're just insufferable, and I just felt really bad for Laura, as she seems like the odd one out and the only person who's there with a just heart. In terms of lore, this arc also gave us flashbacks as to how Glenn's life was probably originally like in the original timeline, before any of this chaos with regression came into play. And what I found interesting was that in the first timeline, it didn't seem like Glenn had any hatred towards Zeke. It was more of Glenn wanting to be a hero such as Zeke. And of course we know why Glenn hates Zeke so much in the final arc, but that is spoilers for this arc, so I'll leave it towards the end when we finally reach that. But at the time of reading this, I did find it interesting, this flashback, as it showed us that Glenn wasn't always a dickhead, and he was at one point a Zeke stan, for lack of better wording. Moving on from Glenn's backstory, his flashback, we really get to see how much of a dick Glenn is once again throughout the arc, as we get to see his thoughts about Laura and how he views her as literally just a doll. He doesn't even see Laura as a person. When talking about how he interacts with her and how he's befuddled that she hasn't dropped a sword for him yet, he's just talking about it like it's a game. He's like, wow, why isn't she doing the things I want her to do? I literally perfected her route, as if Glenn is playing a visual novel. And this just made it all the more satisfying for me when Laura finally stood up for herself to do things like go out with Hans in Beyond the Walls to fight monsters, as well as to ultimately leave the party, which was the best decision that she has ever probably done in the history of decisions that she's done. Something that I found very cute at the end of the arc was of Lila just mocking Zeke. And I found it extremely cute that Nelm played the role of the slain basilisk, just laying there pretending to be dead. I can't wait to see an illustration of this from the manhwa. I know it's a little bit odd to say that this arc is Tyll's arc and not really even bring him up once, but he's a quiet giant. And because of this, you can't really say much about him aside from the fact that, well, I kind of respect him for what he did with his co-captain. I forget his name, but just making a deal with Zeke to not reveal the sins of the co-captain so that his daughter would not have to bear with the sins of the father and deal with society and all of its hatred. With that, we move on to the next arc and return to the Steel Wall Estate. The first thing that we see when returning to the Steel Wall Estate is of a drunk Greg making an embarrassment of himself. I did not expect this at all, but I feel like this is to be expected because of just how much of a trauma that Zeke probably left on him. Just because, like, think about it, like someone who you've bullied and looked down on your whole entire life out of nowhere just beats you up in front of the biggest crowd that you've ever had. And not to mention, not only does he beat you up, but he also just throws insults at your whole entire family and makes a mockery of everyone. And to make it worse, you can't really even say anything because not only did he come out on top, but everything that he says is correct. So all in all, I perfectly understand why Greg is the way he is. On the topic of Greg and his situation, I find Zeke's treatment for Greg hilarious because his treatment plan is not to hype up Greg, but rather do the opposite and show that, hey, Greg, like, you've been worrying about nothing this entire time because you've been worrying about something that you can't even control. Because the difference between you and me is like comparing the sun to a light bulb. So you should get over your PTSD because I'm better than you and it will never change. Moving on from that, I also found it hilarious that everyone is dogpiling on Zeke's mom because although her being a dick is understandable as her family literally disregarded her and used her as a tool to try to get a one-up on the steel walls, she was still a dick nonetheless. And even Zeke and everyone else is just dogpiling on her because of just how much of a dick she was, which is a monumental achievement as not only is people that she's wronged dissing her, but her son is also dissing her. And honestly, I feel like her being such a dick was actually a gift to the world, because if it were not for Zeke feeling bad about how his mother treated Hans, I think the world of this novel would be a much more darker place because they would have missed out on a hero such as Hans who potentially could not have gotten as trained as he did because Zeke probably would not have felt as bad for Hans. Aside from Zeke's mother, I really enjoyed this arc for just bringing back so much memorable characters. Something that I constantly said in my initial video and this video as well is that I really enjoyed the novel for just bringing back characters that we met in past arcs and making them relevant again, not just one-off characters. And reading this novel for the first time, I really hope that this would be a continuous theme and the author does not disappoint as we get to meet again with people that we've met in the first arc, such as Lubella and Weig, and we also get to meet again characters that we met in the recent previous arc, such as Tyll. And just seeing all these characters come back to help Zeke in his time of need just brings a tear to my eye as they recount the positive impact that Zeke has had on their lives despite his disgusting personality. And this, just seeing them reminisce on how much of a positive impact that Zeke has had on them just makes me hate Glenn even more because he fucked with these innocent people and just made their lives a living hell. And if it were not for the tampering of Zeke, their lives could have just been played with by this Glenn dude who's just really a loser who has the power to regress. So watching all of these people have a heartfelt reunion, I was having tears go down my eyes, but I was also wiping those tears with my Glock because I wanted Glenn to once the final battle of the Arc took place. I really loved that Laura was able to finally overcome her gaslighter Glenn, her biggest op, and truly become a girl boss. Speaking of trauma, I also really loved the juxtaposition between Biner and Hans, where one was able to use their trauma of Zeke as fuel to push themselves further, break their limits, and to achieve their dreams of becoming a hero, whereas the other used the trauma to drown themselves in self-pity and ultimately doomed themselves to their death. With all of these positive things being said, I really don't like what the author did with Lila, as throughout the arc, something that Zeke constantly did was tell Lila that he trusts her to not fall under the schemes of Serpina. However, the author ultimately just makes Lila a fool and gets tricked by Serpina. And I saw in the comments other people kind of agreed with this sentiment and just said things like, wow, what the hell? Did Lila just become brain dead? Because even though she's not as adept in schemes as Zeke is, she's not dumb either, to the point that she would fall a victim to such a simple scheme such as the one that she fell to. But I get what the author wanted to do in putting Lila to sleep so that Zeke could get the information that was necessary to defeat Ultol and his whole gang den of thieves. But I felt that it could have definitely been done in a better way, where Lila's character consistency wasn't compromised as a consequence of the author wanting to move or progress the story forward. And with that having been said, the arc comes to a close with everyone in Zeke's party being considered a dragon slayer and having their reputations rise even more. The ending of this arc really felt like an ending. I felt like if the author really wanted to leave everyone with an open ending, this would have been the place, because we got that tearful, somber scene with Zeke saying goodbye to all of his comrades, his party, Hans and Snock, even as he splits up the party, because it's clear that Snock and Hans don't need to be under the tutelage of Zeke anymore, as they've really just matured into their own personalities. And when I read this scene, I was just crying because it filled me with this feeling or sensation that I had never felt before of saying goodbye to, although it was fictional characters, of saying goodbye to characters on a good note rather than saying goodbye to characters on a bad note where they die, say for example. And to say the least, it was an interesting feeling to experience while reading. And it really just makes me realize how powerful writing can be. Getting off of my soapbox, the final arc takes us to the final war on the Bellids, which Zeke leads using the knowledge that Lila sends him, as she is inside the Brushel system and acting as the core. On the topic of the Brushel system, I have mixed feelings about this power system, because although throughout the novel a constant plot device that the author has used is Zeke's memories of his past life, but having Zeke basically be omnipotent through Lila sending him information, it just feels kind of like a deus ex machina that just feels undeserved, because Zeke, we know throughout the story that Zeke is obviously competent enough to be able to solve all these issues, but just having Zeke be able to just be like, oh yeah, I know where the Bellids' main force hideout is because Lila sent me all this information, it just feels kind of cheap and kind of really undeserved. With that aside, let's talk about Ultol, the quote-unquote final villain. In terms of villains, I didn't really feel that much hatred towards Ultol. I felt like his character was really rushed and there wasn't enough time for his character to really marinate, as opposed to someone like Glenn, who us readers were able to really just build up our hatred towards him throughout the whole entire novel, whereas Ultol is just given this final arc to establish his character. And I feel that even the author realized that Ultol would have never been a successful final villain, because he gives Glenn this second wind so that he can make up for what Ultol failed in. Which brings me to my next criticism, which is that I really hated the way that the novel came to a resolution, because it really went from a battle of where like the novel initially started, a battle of skill and scheming and wits, to really just a Dragon Ball Z level of power creep where everyone is just firing off nuclear laser beams. And I hope that it is evidently clear, or abundantly clear, that I love this novel. And I'm only saying these criticisms because I think these held it back from really becoming a masterpiece. With all of this complaining and yapping aside, we get to the ending, which is just so rewarding, as something that we've awaited throughout the whole entire run of the novel is the moment in which Zeke and Lila will finally be together. And in the prior arc, it seemed like it was impossible for these two to finally be in a relationship, as Lila is frozen in the core, and her being forcibly being awoken would have erased all of her memories and her personality in general, and she would have had to start from square one. But of course, this doesn't happen, and Lila is able to escape and provide aid to Zeke, which ultimately helps them win over Glenn, who's just drunk from the mana of the world tree. Once Lila awakes, Zeke immediately heads to her direction to basically propose. And this was probably one of the most rewarding things, or the rewarding moments from the novel. And everything that came afterwards was honestly just a blur to me, just because of how impactful or monumentally meaningful this moment was for me. With that, the novel comes to an end with Zeke and Lila leaving Steelwall once again to go on their own adventures. I can't help but note the juxtaposition between the start of the novel, where Zeke basically leaves the Steelwall family by himself, feeling all alone, with only someone who he basically kidnapped as a hostage by his side, with no one saying farewell to him. But in the final chapter, we see Zeke leave with the love of his life, as a very big group of people are saying their farewells and thanks to them. So this is the end of the novel as of now. I am aware that there might be additional side stories, but as of now, I can't really see where I might be able to read this or where the side stories are available. So this is basically the end. I thoroughly enjoyed my journey reading this novel from start to finish. I loved every character: Hans, Snock, Elena, Lila, Zeke. All of their interactions were just so realistic, and it just made the novel so much more fun to read through. I wish there was more slice of life throughout the novel, and that the end of the novel, the last arc, wasn't as rushed as it was, but somehow the author did manage to just tie up most of the loose ends and made a very, very satisfactory ending. And I'm happy with what the author gave us. If you've watched for this long, I thank you for watching for this long, and hope you have a wonderful day.